Hi, everybody. This is Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week we have a special guest from Tulsa, Oklahoma. His name is Josh Lewis. He's a CPA who lives and works in Tulsa for the Oklahoma State Auditor's Office. He's a former candidate for city auditor with over a decade of experience in auditing governments. He also has a unique and practical perspective as an outsider observer of politics put into practice. He also runs his own blog. There will be notes for it in the notes section of the podcast, but you can also head over there right now. Josh, how are you doing?
Hey, doing good. Always happy to get into a political discussion with just about anybody.
Yeah, and actually it's a weird day because I was at a coffee shop doing some work this morning, and a woman interrupted me and someone else talking to ask us if she could interview us for the BBC News about, I guess Donald Trump is in town. I live in Phoenix, speaking for the first time since he was convicted. I don't follow politics, so I had no idea he was here, and of course I knew he was convicted. And anyway, she asked me to go on because I'm apolitical and I truly don't like either candidate, which I don't mind saying on the show. And so it was interesting, but I was a little fearful because we live in an era where people are reluctant to talk about politics, but I'm always not reluctant to talk about it with people one-on-one. So I'm actually excited, and you're an expert. So before we get into that, real quick, just 3 quick questions. How old are you? Where did you grow up? And what generation, if any, do you consider yourself a member of?
I am 41 years old, born 1982. You grew up in 80, or you were born in 81, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
So we're about the same age. And you mentioned Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was born and raised here. Pretty much lived in the greater Tulsa, Oklahoma area all my life. But I would call myself a millennial. It's interesting you asked that question. I almost wonder sometimes it's coming from you and I being somewhat the same age. We're right on that cusp, but we're kind of millennials, kind of Gen Xers. And I think the best evidence I have that I'm a millennial is that I ascribe to the view that it was really the baby boomers' fault. They were born between 1946 1964. Like we know what a baby boomer is. It was when there was an action. Nobody's arguing about that. But then after that, they have to come up with this term, Generation X. Who the heck knows what that means? Eventually, they get around to millennial. So it's the boomers' fault. They messed it up. That's why we're naming generations. So that's why we're kind of in this weird. So I think I'm a millennial because I'm blaming them.
That is a great answer. That's very creative and hilarious. I really do feel like you and I are both part of this weird like micro generation, and you can call it whatever you want. But we kind of just saw both sides, and I know like my musical taste and like a lot of that stuff skews Gen X, but then certainly my adoption of technology is anything but Gen X. So it's a good question. It's an interesting question, and I actually loved your answer because we do live in this like incredible time of like 2 groups that seem to be at war. So let's just jump into it. You call yourself an outside observer of politics put into practice. Can you define that a little better for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's at multiple layers, right? I'm an outside observer in the sense that I work for the state of Oklahoma. So I work in government, but I'm also an auditor. So I'm auditing government. Mm-hmm. I often say we don't audit taxpayers, we audit government. We're the good auditors. But I also have been involved at various capacities with the local Republican Party here in Oklahoma, and then in Missouri when I went to college. But I also feel very much like an outsider. Without getting too much into the weeds, I'll just say, I think you'll know me what I'm talking about. I have been alarmed and distressed at the direction my party has taken since 2016. Mm-hmm. Still very much consider myself to be a Republican and especially a conservative. Mm-hmm. But it has I am under no delusion that I have the majority opinion within the party. So I am somewhat an outsider in that respect.
That was a great answer. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask you all the crazy questions that I'm always dying to ask someone exactly like you. I have friends like you, but they're not like actually in politics or involved the way you are. So while their answers are interesting and we've talked about this subject, I'm fascinated by someone who like really participates. I guess my first question would be, how would you, in the year 2024, as we record this, define what a conservative person in America is?
Gosh, I have been trying for 4 years to come up with a succinct answer for a conservative. It depends on the context of what we're talking about, right?
Okay.
If I'm in a group of people and say I'm a conservative and I understand they're going to immediately equate that to be I must support everything that is loosely speaking on the right today. That's not what I mean by conservative. I tend to mean something that is quite a bit more philosophical. It's a bit more of a worldview in nature. I think the simplest definition I ever heard, the late great conservative philosopher Sir Roger Scruton, says that it begins with this sentiment that is not unique to conservatives. All reasonable people hold this, And the sentiment is just this: the good things we have in this life are easily destroyed and taken from us and not easily created, and therefore an appropriate posture toward our life is one of preservation. Now, we can build a lot on top of that, but a conservative, I guess, in that regard is one who, if we oppose it to, say, the progressives trying to make the situation better, we're here just trying to make sure it doesn't get any worse.
Ah, yeah. Wow. So it's like a counterforce as opposed to a force. Is that fair to say?
To a degree. I mean, it gets messed up because when we're a force or counterforce compared to what? Because it's not as if conservatives have. It's not as if the moment culture changes, conservatives say, okay, that's what we now have to conserve. There has to be some sort of an underlying bedrock principle we're moving toward. But it's sort of a recognition. It's a posture that humanity is imperfectible, and that as such, we ought to exercise caution and prudence when we move forward, because just vesting too much power in central authorities can go awry because of our imperfectibility.
Yeah, I love that, which is also part of why, as someone who is literally about as third party as you can get, meaning like that's essentially all I've ever voted for and all I've really ever, like, I don't want to be affiliated with a party, so I don't register and I don't vote in primaries, with one exception. But to me, that you're kind of summarizing why I don't like getting into a party, because you're in a party and your party has been, from, again, my perspective, captured, so to speak. And it seems like the team would rather win than admit it's been captured. And I can't, I'm not trying to like not talk about Donald Trump, but I also feel that like the second you say his name, it's like this Harry Potter Voldemort like effect where like, and no one really wants to talk about it, but I do think everyone wants to hear solutions that might help them feel at ease about what has happened in America, which is that I feel like my friends who are loyal Democrats feel like their party is divided, and I feel like people like you feel like your party is divided, and yet neither party has divided. Part of that I would speculate is due to what we're talking about, a counterforce or a force. Like, if we divide, we will be conquered. So I just threw a lot of splatter at the mural. Do you want to just kind of pick out whatever you want and comment on it?
Yeah, in my blog and my podcast, Saving Elephants, is I mean, at times this feels like a fool's errand, right? I'm trying to call the Republican Party specifically back to conservatism. Look, I completely get this, the sentiment or the idea or the desire to not be affiliated with either party. And that is a completely honorable and understandable position. I mean, good grief, we could spend an hour going through all the misgivings of any party today, let alone throughout the history of the parties. That being said, our particular political system, first past the post, is one in which it would be unrealistic to think that something other than the Republican or Democratic Party is going to assume power. And so it becomes this and this is always a tension within those of us who deal with politics. It's a lot easier to just stay in your ivory towers of debating political philosophy. But occasionally you have to get your hands grubby and say, okay, but how do we actually enact policy? And that's when sometimes prudence demands you have to figure, okay, where do our principles take us? How do we negotiate? How do we compromise? And part of that, unfortunately, is dealing with these really messy, terrible things we call parties. Now, it is obviously, as I mentioned, I mean, you said Donald Trump. My best episodes were the ones where I think I go the entire episode without ever mentioning his name, not intentionally, just we talk about other things. And I think the issue is so much bigger than him, but immediately people know what we're talking about when we bring up that name. It becomes a prudential question sometimes. Okay, at what point does a party coalesce around a central figure and become a cult of personality, such that to participate in it, you're not actually doing any good? And I have many principled, wise friends that have come up with 1,000 different answers to that question. And I don't think there is any one right answer. And sometimes it shifts based on the time, but that is sort of the grubby fight, right? It's we want a pure world in which we can point to a party and say, that's my guide star. We're never going to get a perfect party. So it's this constant shift of, okay, what do you support to advance your principles without compromising?
Wow, that was a lot to think about. It was very eloquent and well said what you said. Where my brain is kind of stalling out is, it seems like, to me, the reason I started with like, what does the word conservative means? Just to give you perspective, I grew up in like probably the polar opposite of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is Berkeley, California.
Oh yeah.
And I am somewhat of a contrarian by nature, so you can imagine how confusing I was to my peers, and I felt on the inside as an adolescent who followed politics, because I was like dying to not fit in with like the overwhelming vibe in that area, but at the same time I listened to like rock music, played guitar, and had like interests that were not conservative, and I didn't like, labels on CDs that said explicit lyrics and things like that. So I've always balked at the term conservative. Now that I'm, I'm 42, going on 43, I am 100% a conservative person by like any way you define it in the context of 2024. Like I hear things that are too air quotes progressive for me, and I do agree with one of the first things you said, which is there's a certain element of preservation that I'd like to see go on, and I can be like really specific about this because I've thought so much about this. Like how would I explain myself to like a Gen Z person who respects me and then is suddenly losing respect when I say what I just said? And it would be just, it's sad when you go to a nice restaurant and you know that the owner spent a lot of time and effort making it look nice, and everyone's dressed in slobby clothes with like loud t-shirts with band names on them. And like, people have like, there's like such a lack of propriety. Like people say what's happened on airlines. I would say what happened was we opened the Pandora's box of like, hey, wear whatever you want and say whatever you want and be whoever you want on a plane. Whereas you and I both remember as children, like in the 80s, there was like a real reverence for like your behavior in public. Do you agree with the things I just said?
I do, and it's a weird juxtaposition because sometimes in the on the east and west coast, the predominant progressive areas of the United States,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, especially among the elite, they have very progressive politics, but they themselves live an incredibly conservative life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think some of that is just a holdover from these traditions and things that this stuff makes sense. It turns out it's a better world to live in when we behave with a certain amount of decorum and respect and at least some semblance of a culture. Now, obviously, you can go too far with that. As you mentioned, throwing the explicit lyrics on the CDs, or and it's a long debate on the right. But precisely what is the role of government or the
Mm-hmm.
state
Yeah.
in trying to monitor these things? But at a very broad view, I think conservatives have long maintained: look, regardless of what the government's role is, you can't actually have a society of ordered liberty for very long if the individuals within that society are not themselves ordered or behaving in any sort of capacity as reasonable adults.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever mechanisms, whether it's the church, whether it's some sort of community centers or belief systems, whatever it is that allows people to behave themselves as well, or basically as decent individuals, is a necessary precursor for liberty.
Yeah, and I think you just summed up why I'm so disenchanted from politics. Just looking at just the two people who are the main headline candidates for the president of the United States of America in 2024, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I would say the word reasonable adult does not apply to either of them. And then I could start to list the third in command for, I could just spill it down, and then I would probably get to someone like Cory Booker, and I'd pause and say, he seems like he might be a reasonable adult. Like, I'm just throwing one name out there. But like, the point is, I feel like there are very few leaders in any business, entertainment, politics, anything that are reasonable adults who are mouthpieces, who are like spokespeople and people that we're seeing and hearing from. There are many reasonable adults. You are one, I am one. Most of our audience is probably one. I said most, but it's hard to tell. So how do you feel as a conservative? Because your statements are good, and I can tell your integrity is super high. So what is like the inner turmoil like when you're looking at that, like in politics in particular?
Yeah, and it's, as I mentioned earlier, we're imperfectible, right? So I think each human, we have what is it? Solzhenitsyn said about the problem is it's not a matter of they're good and we're bad. It's the good and evil. The line runs in each human heart.
Yeah,
and so we have the capacity for decency, but we can both rise above through the greater angels of our nature. But we also have the capacity for depravity. I would point you to one of the more important conservative thinkers alive today, and he's not that much older than we are, as Yuval Levin, a director of the AEI, not-for-profit institute. And he has, I think, a particularly helpful model for looking at this. He talks about, I mentioned earlier, it's necessary within societies that we maintain some sort of decency. And it's not just a matter of we all grit our teeth and try it. The way in which character is formed typically comes by institutions, and those can take a variety of forms. Sometimes the institution could be as simple as your family. Sometimes it's as simple as getting in an elevator because it's awkward to stand and face somebody instead of facing the door. You sort of learn these habits and norms.
Mm-hmm.
But what Yuval Levin talks about is part of the problem we're dealing with these days is our institutions have changed, partially due to the advent of social media and other technologies. They've ceased to be entities that mold us into a certain character, and they have instead become a platform that allows us to display ourselves for everyone else to see.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that we end up with scenarios, and I mean, Donald Trump is probably the prime example of this, but you can even think back to Barack Obama, of individuals who would use their office of presidency, arguably the highest office there is, and then tweet storms, here's what we ought to be doing. And oftentimes Trump would even say somebody needs to do X when it was, in fact, he was the person legally charged with doing X. And so it becomes this sort of mindset shift to where we go to church, who we choose to affiliate ourselves with in our work and cause, it's supposed to say something about us. It's we show up at the institution so that we can be shown via the institution. Whereas the older model, the one that's conducive to good government, good society, we go to that institution so that it forms us, so that it molds us into something. And Levin has a way of thinking about this. I think immediately makes sense. It says one of those institutions that still exists that has a lot of respect is the United States military. If you think about it, that's one thing they do very well. You go into the military, you come out a soldier. It changes you. It forms you into this thing. Now, we could argue that may be a good or a bad institution, but the point being, if we could ever get back to thinking of our institutions as something that changes us for the better of that institution, which is going to outlive us most likelihood, then we can plug our society back into this character building machine that is conducive to good government.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example. I've taught at all levels, and I've also volunteered in a lot of schools, and I would say that while a school should not be a military academy and it should not feel like a prison, it also should not be a place where kids have like headphones in and they're allowed to like put the middle finger up to the teacher. And so I've watched the degradation of like leadership and training and effective deterrence and incentive systems in schools. And I understand that this is like a big mixed bag, and so I'm not going to like get into these nuances, but I would wonder from someone as smart and you used the word honorable earlier, but like your answers and the way you think is honorable to me. So what would it take for someone like you to stop, air quotes, voting for the lesser of two evils? Like, at what point would you say, you know what, I just can't vote for any evil? And I'm asking because I'm hoping people like you are at least thinking about that.
Yeah, and maybe I could answer that in terms of just making it very practical. Let's say in the 2024 election, vote between Biden and Trump. And I did not vote for Trump or Biden in 2020. I didn't vote for Trump or Hillary in 2016. It was the first time I had not voted for presidential candidates. Now, I didn't vote for any presidential candidate in that ticket, but that's just the accident of where I am here in Oklahoma. You only have 3 people on the ballot to choose from. I didn't think any of them deserved the vote. I still voted for lots of candidates on that ballot, just not in those particular races.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, let me stress here, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of good, smart, decent, honorable people that will look at this and come up with very different decisions. So I'm not trying to disparage people that would think different. But my thought process is, and look, I'm just going to be frank with you. I do believe Trump to be the greater danger between Trump and Biden.
Interesting.
Biden is someone I would say is a very bad president. Trump is someone who has the potential to be a very dangerous president.
Very well said.
And so if I'm in this capacity of, okay, Josh, you have to pick between these two people, and say, okay, I guess it would be Biden. I don't like Biden. I don't think he deserves another 4 years, and I think it would be damaging to the country. But if I had to choose, I live in Oklahoma. We all know how Oklahoma's going to vote.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say my vote doesn't matter, but to me, the way it matters is an indication of who I believe has at least enough honor that they deserve my vote. And knowing that it in no way is going to impact the election here, I don't feel like in good faith I can support either of these individuals. Though I recognize someone else could, follow that same line of thinking and say, well, clearly I have to vote for this person.
Yeah, I mean, that rings so true because I grew up in California, and that's not the only state I voted in, but my first election was California. And then at one point I was also living in New York, and you could just throw your vote in the toilet. It doesn't matter. But in Arizona where I live, it matters a lot. And so it is interesting because in Yeah, I was surprised by your answer in a very good way, and I think I had a friend convince me to vote for Biden in 2020, and he is normally a Republican, and it was the exact same argument. And he's in the military, and that's how he convinced me. He said, "I don't feel after 4 years of being as high as I am in the military that it would be a good or safe idea to have Donald Trump in charge. He is
Mm-hmm.
technically the commander in chief, and a great general has quit over him." And so I'm fascinated by your answer because it gives me a lot of hope, and I also do feel like that really is the most responsible way to look at where we are now. I want to, we can come back to this topic, but I do want to shift gears because we always ask every guest about what they think happens when you die. And before we get into that, I didn't even ask you if you have like a religious persuasion. A lot of people in our country, and especially not in our country, assume that all Republicans are diehard Christians who are like evangelical and then some. And I would say that same stereotype is often applied to Oklahoma. I know better. I've been to Oklahoma. I have plenty of friends who are Okies. But I am curious, how do you feel about those assertions, and what is your actual religious philosophy, if you care to share it?
No, I'm more than happy to share it, although I don't know that we're going to be able to make too much headway in the limited time we've got.
Yeah, yeah.
But I would just say that to it, I understand the stereotypes. They are, I think those stereotypes are both true but unhelpful because it doesn't recognize the nuances within those truths.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what I mean by that is I think, what most people would rightly label an evangelical Protestant. So I'm a Christian. I'm a follower of Christ. I would, my faith would be very similar to what you would probably think of as a traditional Christian.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I know that oftentimes when people make that statement, what they mean is, and here I'm going to use a word that's maybe a little bit too exact than I intend for it to be, but a more fundamentalist, an individual who is Republican evangelical has to drive a truck, shoot a gun, and
Yeah,
vote for Donald Trump.
totally.
And I know plenty of people like that, and they're good, decent, hardworking people.
Mm-hmm.
But I think my evangelicalism is, well, I'll put it this way. I am way too progressive for the fundamentalists, and I'm way too fundamentalist for the progressives. So I tend to just upset everybody with my views.
We're actually pretty similar. I completely understand what you're saying, and I actually don't even want to follow up on it because I actually think there's nuance to people's understanding of what you just said. If I try to unpack it, it becomes like almost lecturing. So
Sure.
I completely understand what you're saying, and that is why I asked that before I ask what do you think is going to happen when you die, because I do feel like whether you're fundamental, progressive, evangelical, all that, and this is why I started the podcast, I actually do feel like your opinion, one's opinion of what happens when you die, has a lot to do with how you judge the behavior, actions, and morality and ethics on Earth. So what do you think is going to happen when you die?
Yeah, that's another big question. So again, evangelical Protestant Christian, so I would hold what I presume most people would say at a basic level is a traditional view, which maybe the first place I should start is saying, I really don't know.
Okay.
There's an awful lot that within the Christian tradition we don't know, but there is at least enough information. Again, I'm talking about from Scripture and from the traditions of the Christian Church, that we're not completely clueless. We profess a faith in the idea that faith in Christ reconciles us back to God, our Creator. And I don't know if we want to open this whole can of worms, but this, of course, leads to the very unpleasant topic of, okay, well, what exactly happens to the person who does not profess faith in Christ and is not reconciled with their Creator after they die? And I will just say, as a general commentary, it's trying to think how to put this succinctly. I do believe hell to be a real place. I don't necessarily profess to know exactly what all that means. And I think oftentimes the traditional imagery of hell of being torment and fire and brimstone, well, I think is very intentionally put into Scripture, isn't necessarily meant to be taken as literally as sometimes it is.
Yeah. I've never shared this on this podcast, but when I think about hell, all I really hope it is, if it's real, is a place where you have to face accountability, that like you can't dodge it, ignore it, take another puff, another line, like you can't just keep using everything you can to distract yourself from your own conscience. And that to me would be true hell, because the few times in my life where I've done something without thinking about the repercussions and then I felt deep regret because I saw the repercussions, that was hell. It was hell to like pray that people would not judge me, that I would be offered forgiveness. And it's funny because these things are so minor now that I'm in my 40s, you know, like they're not like,
Hmm.
I'm not talking about like the time I murdered someone. I'm talking about like literally like the time I lied about something to get out of work, and then I realized like my coworker had to work a double, you know, and it's just, I just felt like terrible. But so the only part of it that I've always wondered and is that, do you have to like specifically say Christ, or is it just about the idea of Christ? Because otherwise it seems unfair that, you know, if you're born in a country where like no one's even heard of Christ and no one's prophesized there, you're just like punished for not even knowing that. But meanwhile, it would seem to me that it's more like metaphorical. Is that your belief?
Yeah, and this is an area where, well, first of all, I should probably say, not that this is surprising, anything I say from this point on, Christians differ on these
Yeah,
views,
yeah,
so I'm not trying
absolutely.
to represent Christianity full stop.
No, and that's why you are Josh Lewis. I am interviewing you, and that's the whole point of this podcast. Is
Right.
I'm trying to actually help people see that. So yeah, no, please, I commend
No,
that.
and that is an extraordinary that is a question we've been wrestling with for thousands of years,
Yeah,
right? Because there is certainly within Scripture there does appear to be an enormous amount of exclusivity that Christ says, "I am the way, the truth, and the light. No man can come by the Father but through me." That seems pretty darn specific.
hmm
Now, some would and this is I don't go this far. Some would go so far as, well, you have to say these specific words, a specific prayer. I think what we do know from Scripture is that God is actively at work in redeeming His creation.
hmm hmm
I, again, being a professing Christian, believe that Christ is the way to God, but how precisely the Holy Spirit ministers to people and brings them to Him, it I don't know. I don't claim to know all that. I know there are some professing Christians that said, no, if you don't hear the gospel and you don't profess Christ, then when you die, you will spend eternity in torment. That just seems too big for me to comprehend.
Yeah, yeah,
And so I'm not trying to hedge. I guess I'm trying to say I'm trying to be a little careful that um, I don't want to say something out of turn I just don't know, because I think on the one hand, a Christian can err in saying, you know what, God's got this all under control. Therefore, there is no responsibility on my part to share the gospel. But you can also err going the other direction, thinking, unless someone has my extremely unique set of views,
yeah.
they are somehow subhuman, and my role in this life is to consistently treat them as such until they've joined my cause. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle there, and I don't confess to necessarily know where.
No, definitely. And I appreciate your approach because it's actually what I hope most people are like you, whether they are Hindu, whether they are Christian, whether they're atheist. It doesn't matter. I just hope that it's a private conversation with themselves, and you know, and obviously I think it extends to like who you're going to marry and who you're going to like try to like surround yourself with and live with. But that's not the same thing as saying you can't be unlike me, which is what we're discussing. But within this context, I'm actually curious to turn it kind of inward on you. Has there ever been a time in your life where you like the only reason you said no was because of the fear of hell or because of the incentive of heaven, or has it been pretty easy for you to live that life just based on the way you think and react and behave? Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks.
Yeah, so these are short conversations, so there's a lot we can get into
Yeah.
there. My faith tradition growing up was I grew up in an old-fashioned Free Holiness Pentecostal church, and I'm not sure
Oh wow.
if you're
Yeah.
all that familiar with it, but it's we didn't wear neckties because that was too radical. The Pentecostals did that,
Mm.
and it very much, to be honest, it wasn't so much hellfire and brimstone I was afraid of. It was the mark of the beast. It was the end time. That
Mm.
just every time something happened in the Middle East, this is it. They're going to
Mm-hmm.
put us all in concentration camps.
Yeah.
I'm not
That's
necessarily saying
scary.
that's what the adults professed and believed, but that's how, as like an 8-year-old boy, it sounded.
Yeah.
And so there was an awful lot of that. Now, throughout my adult life, I would say that it's a complicated issue, because I think we live in a world in which we need a certain the fear of God. I think is a very good thing to possess. That's different than the terror of God, say. I don't think you're in a good spot if you think this next moment, if I die, that you experience some sort of trauma as you're living, thinking about what awaits you. But I do think it's necessary that we have a sort of a God-fearing nature in the sense that this actually matters in some sense. That this isn't just that we aren't just here to puff ourselves up, but that there is some sort of eternal value, that even if, and whether we get there through love or fear, and here again, I don't mean fear as terror, I just mean regard for, this is important. I think there's a mixture there that actually can be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know why this question is popping into my brain, but it feels like I just have a intuitive feeling you'll have a creative, if not intelligent answer to this. Do you believe in extraterrestrial life? And if, as a second part to that, even if you don't, if extraterrestrial life was proven in our lifetime, how would that shake or not shake your faith in all of this, what we just discussed, specifically about Christianity and religion and humans? Intelligent extraterrestrial life, I should add that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, if we find bacteria out there somewhere.
Exactly.
My gut is that there probably is not extraterrestrial life out there. Now,
okay. Yeah.
When you ask, do I believe that? It doesn't mean I don't believe in the same sense that I suspect the sun's going to come up tomorrow, and I would be quite surprised if it didn't. If we discover extra intelligent life out there somewhere, okay, I'm entirely willing to acknowledge it could be wrong about that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In regard to the faith, though, and I don't necessarily know if this is what you're getting at, but it reminds me of the conversation I heard years ago about Carl Sagan, the famed, I don't know if it'd be fair to call him an atheist, but at least the agnostic scientist. He was very much into I think it's called SETI, the program that searches for extraterrestrial life, shooting messages out in space, hoping to get a response. And was asked once, why is this important? Now, I think all of us can agree, if we actually found intelligent life out there, that would be pretty darn important. But specifically for him, why do you think we ought to be doing this? And his response was, when we learn who they are, we will find out who we are. And someone had pointed out kind of the potential irony of such a statement. Says, imagine if we actually do get a message, and that message is, when we learn who they are, we will find out who we are. And the point of saying that was this sort of, it's not so much that extraterrestrial life is unimportant. It's that I think sometimes we try to make something too big out there and other, rather than, and this again is a Christian view. If the message of Christianity is true, it's not that extraterrestrial intelligent life is unimportant. It's that it doesn't necessarily impede or destroy the gospel message.
Wow, I really like that answer. Yeah, no, I wasn't leading you and I wasn't going anywhere. I just knew that your answer would be different than the ones I'm used to hearing. And part of that is a compliment to you. You're really an individual who is working for like a team and a group cause, and I find that fascinating. And I was very surprised by a lot of your answers. I wasn't shocked and I wasn't offended and I wasn't any word that someone would want to throw into that. It was just literally surprised. And I didn't feel like I was on my toes, but I felt actively... I was a very active listener during today's interview, and that's why I'm going to extend something to you that I've never done before, which is normally I give people the floor at the end of the interview to just kind of say their spiel. I'm still reserving that for you, but I'm going to actually give you two different spiels I would like you to give. The last one, not the first one, I would like to be like your spiritual, because that's what I like to end on, is like what's a message you want to like give to our audience, which is full of every kind of person, and on purpose, quite intentionally. But before that, I am also curious. I mean, we are on the verge of an election. You do have really interesting points about politics, and like you said in your bio, and like you said, you're an outsider, and you're active, and you fight the good fight as a CPA. So, what would you like to tell our audience, no matter what affiliation they have about politics? And then after that, you can do the other part.
Yeah, well, you're very kind, and I appreciate that. So I guess if we start with, it does seem like we've had kind of two conversations throughout this entire thing. So in terms of politics, I mean, gosh, there's a ton I could say, but I think the first thing that comes to mind is, if you're at all of a similar mindset to what I've expressed here, I recognize this as an extremely discouraging time. So too, if you're 110% on Team Red or Team Blue, and your guy does not win in 2024, that's also going to be a very devastating moment. I think the main thing I would like to share is we will make it as a nation. I mean, bad things can happen, but the decision for something as, God forbid, civil war, or what would be also devastating but not as bad, some sort of a national divorce, that is our decision. That is not, this 2024 election is not the be all end all of the country. It's bad. I don't I don't want to sugarcoat that. But this talk about how we're just right on the cusp of this whole thing falling apart is complete nonsense. We are going to survive. This is still an incredibly prosperous nation of opportunities, and we ought to be proud of that and not live in such fear.
I would stand up and give you an applause ovation if I could. That was like, I am so glad I asked that question. So thank you so much. And just in case anyone's listening, yes, I am 100% endorsing what he just said, and I could not have phrased it better. Don't give up, and don't let any result from this sway you from what's actually important, which is how do you treat your friends and peers, and how do you respect the actual country that we're in, which is an institution. And you spoke about institutions and leadership and how they affect people. So thank you. That was tremendous. I'm full of joy from that answer. So now more of the same. Please summarize exactly how I feel about spirituality. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, and what would you like to tell our overall audience? And again, your blog will be in the notes, and I'm happy to have people head over there. So.
Yeah, and the blog is more on the politics. I'm more than happy to talk about my faith, but you won't get quite as much of that there. But again, lots I could say. I think the thing that springs to mind, though, and I'm going to tie this in, I guess, with the conservatism we're talking about earlier. I think one of the things that we seem to be suffering from in this present moment is a profound sense of alienation, and this is different per individual. But there's a lot of ways in which the traditions and the institutions we've respected for generations have been shattered. I'm not saying they didn't deserve to be shattered. Some of them have done some pretty horrible things. But I would just encourage, from a spiritual perspective, look, I'm just some guy on a podcast, right? What do I know? I would advise someone, though, if they're searching spiritually, to be mindful that you at least give some sort of reverence to a tradition. In other words, our spiritual journeys, while yes, they do affect us personally, they're so much bigger than just whatever we can come up with on our own. It really is of enormous comfort and vitality if you can plug into a tradition of other humans that have gone before you, that have wrestled with these very deep questions and have found peace for themselves. That we're not just islands out there, but we actually do benefit from understanding our traditions and our history.
That was a great answer. I completely agree. I definitely grew up in a place where that's not common, and yet also common with individuals, and I really agree. Community is everything, and especially for mental health. So thank you, Josh Lewis. You've been a tremendous guest. I'm full of vitality and thoughts, and this is why I do the podcast. So thank you so much for coming on our show. Again, everyone, please head over to savingelefantsblog.com, where you can find more of this incredible man's mind. And if you want to support our show, as always, just head over to mikeyop.com. That's MIKEYOPP.com, and sign up for our once a week free email. Once again, my name is Mike Oppenheim. You have been listening to Coffin Talk, and we will see you soon.